Sandra, I believe you're on mute still.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. Chairwoman Sandra Rosenberg, for the record, I'd like to call to order the November 19th, 2020 meeting of the Executive Advisory Committee. RTC staff will begin with a roll call of committee members, introduce staff on the line, and also touch on a few housekeeping items.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. David Gloria, Management Analyst for the RTC, for the record. I'll be calling your name in alphabetical order. Please confirm your attendance as I read your name. Travis Anderson.
Here, thank you.
Mario Bermudez.
Here.
Dennis Cederberg.
Here.
Dale Daffern.
Present.
Susan Danielowitz.
Present.
Tom Davey.
Here.
Keegan Luttrell.
Present.
Johanna Murphy.
Present.
Joey Paskey.
Present.
Chair Sandra Rosenberg.
Present.
Richard Sechrist.
Here.
Fred Solis.
Here.
And Michael Tassi.
I'm here. Good morning.
Thank you. Please note we have several RTC staff on the line for today's meeting. This includes Mr. David Swallow, Deputy CEO, Mr. John Penuelis, Senior Director of Engineering, Mr. Craig Rayborn, Director of the Metropolitan Planning Organization, Mr. David Clyde, Associate General Counsel, Mr. Joe Damiani, Manager of Engineering, Mr. Andrew Kelman, Manager of Transportation Planning, Ms. Ray Lathrop, Manager of Regional Planning, Ms. Michelle Laramie, Senior Regional Planner, and finally, Mr. Daniel Fazekas, Senior Regional Planner. We also have Mr. Marco Violetta with the City of Las Vegas and Mr. Greg Servin from Clark County with us on the line to present on an item. As the chairwoman mentioned, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. When Chair Rosenberg asks for comments or questions from the committee or calls for a roll call vote, please remember to unmute your line before speaking. Remember to state your name for the record before providing comment. Be sure to mute your line if you are not speaking, and voting will be done verbally. The chair will call for ayes and nays. If there are no nays, then the motion will carry. If there are nays, then a roll call vote will be required. In the event of a roll call vote, please wait for your name to be read to provide your vote. The chair will call for any comments or questions after an item has been presented. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Gloria. Mr. Penuelis, for the first item, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. John Penuelis, RTC Senior Director of Engineering, for the record. The first item on the agenda is to conduct the first citizens participation period. But before that, I'd like to remind everyone that on March 22nd, 2020, the State of Nevada Executive Department issued Declaration of Emergency Directive 006, which suspended the requirement to have a physical location for public meetings. Pursuant to Directive 006 and for the health and safety of the community, this meeting is being held virtually. To allow for public participation, the RTC is accepting public comments via email at publiccomments@rtcsnb.com. Comments can be submitted to be read aloud or to be added directly to the written record. Mr. David Gloria will read public comments received by the RTC.
Thank you, Chairwoman Rosenberg. For the record, this is the first time set aside for public comment. This time is limited to comments on items included on the agenda. Comments will be limited to the first 500 words, with the remaining words to be included in the written record. How many comments?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. David Gloria, for the record. There are no public comments at this time.
Thank you. Moving on, Mr. Penuelis.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Item 2 is to approve the agenda. The agenda is in order and ready for your approval.
Are there any questions or comments from the committee on the agenda? Hearing none, do we have a motion to approve the agenda?
This is Mario Bermudez. I make motion to approve.
Thank you. In favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. The motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Penuelis.
Yes, Madam Chair. Did I hear somebody? Okay, I'm sorry. The next item is to approve the consent agenda. This consists of items 3 through 25 and can be taken in one motion.
Thank you. Are there any comments or questions from the committee? Hearing none. Was there a comment? No. Okay. Hearing none, is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Keegan Littrell, I make a motion to approve the consent agenda.
Thank you. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion carried. Thanks. Oh, was there a comment? Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Rayborn.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Craig Rayborn, Director of the Metropolitan Planning Organization, for the record. Item 26 is to receive an update on the Nevada Department of Transportation's implementation of the One Nevada statewide transportation plan, and it will be presented by NDOT staff. I'll now turn the floor back over to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. It's a little awkward to have you introduce me to do my presentation, but thank you very much. I have been thinking for some time it's a good idea to just update this committee on the One Nevada Transportation Plan implementation. Next slide, please. The One Nevada Transportation Plan was adopted in 2018. It addresses planning requirements under the MAP 21 and FAST Acts. It's performance-based, long-range, and it established 6 goals. So the plan itself was really the foundation for our new and improved planning process across the state. It aligns with national, regional, and statewide goals. It's transparent, data-driven, establishes the framework for a transparent, data-driven prioritization process of long, mid-range, and short-range projects. And since adoption in 2018, we've really been working on the implementation, how to put this great idea into practice. And that's what I'm going to talk about a little bit today. Next slide, please. So what are we trying to do here? We wanted to establish statewide goals and performance measures to indicate what we're trying to accomplish, develop planning financial forecasts to kind of understand the constraints we're working with, determine funding distribution, and that's where those two things kind of come together in terms of what kinds of investments help us get to our goals and our performance measures that we'd like to see. And then, of course, we make the investments, collect data, and return back to the beginning, and it's a circular process. Next slide, please. Overall goal is to filter projects from the long-range needs to a prioritized list of funded projects. However, we already had, when we started this process, we already had a large list of identified projects that were unconstrained or prioritized. So we started, rather than start with the long-range assessment of needs, we actually started with the STIP and annual work program first because of the large list of identified projects. This year was the first time we produced a STIP and work program that was truly performance-based and data-driven. Refinement of the process is needed, but now we're working on all 3 timeframes, that long, mid, and short range, as we continue to improve the criteria and refine the process. Next slide, please. So I think it's important to understand NDOT's planning documents and how it aligns with the MPO planning documents. So we have a number, they're all kind of consolidated into one platform that we call the ESTIP, but we do have distinct actual project lists and planning programs per state and federal requirements. So the annual work program is really the current year's list of NDOT-led projects. That's what is approved by our board annually. But with that, as part of the work program, the annual is the first year. As part of the work program, we also have a short range element, which is years 2 through 4, and the long range element, which is anything beyond year 4, so 5 and beyond. But the short range element and the annual work program together also align with the STIP. The STIP includes all federally funded or regionally significant projects, including the MPO's TIPs. So we include the TIP by reference without change into the STIP. So as many of you know, there's a lot of back and forth in terms of regional priorities and state priorities and who's leading what project when. And we work very closely with MPO staff to ensure alignment in those first 4 years. But there is also the state requirements that we work under as well. Next slide, please. So as part of the One Nevada plan, through a pretty extensive public and stakeholder engagement, we developed 6 goals: enhance safety, preserve infrastructure, optimize mobility, transform economies, foster sustainability, and connect communities. These pretty well align with RTC's MPO goals, as well as the MPOs throughout the state, and other statewide goals, as well as national performance measures. So as part of, so that's what was in the plan itself, and part of the implementation is how we use those goals, how we measure them, how we weight projects against those goals. So we developed 15 criteria within those 6 goal areas, and developed a way to score and rank for each project in each of those goal areas. So that's kind of the sort of pure data-driven prioritization process. It is imperfect, of course, as most of these processes are. We're still working on some of the data in some cases. In some cases, it's qualitative. In some cases, it's quantitative. But it doesn't tell the full story. So when we do the prioritization, we also do what we call harmonization. And the harmonization is looking at that prioritization, but also bringing into light funding eligibility. So just because the project is prioritized highly, we have to make sure we have the right types of funds for it. Readiness, dependencies. So if a project is dependent on another project going first or at the same time, making sure those are aligned in time. Performance targets and geographic distribution. So for example, on the performance targets, we have targets on pavement and bridge condition, and we want to make sure after prioritization and looking at readiness and eligibility that we are investing enough to maintain or improve those measures on things like pavement preservation, safety, all of that. So, and then of course, geographic distribution. I know that's important to this community as well. So we look at all of those factors after kind of the pure prioritization. And that's how the program comes together. And I will say, I think readiness is probably one of the biggest driving factors, but all of those harmonization pieces are critically important to put together a program of projects that helps meet our goals and meets the needs of the traveling public. Next slide. So after the initial STIP prioritization, we're working on refining that process. And this is going to be an ongoing process. I don't think we'll ever be done. We continue to work on refining the data, criteria, the tools, and the process used to prioritize and harmonize the projects in the STIP. But ultimately, we're trying to deliver a process, including not just the initial identification of the STIP, but the amendment process, how to determine what changes to scope or budget affect the process. And critically important to that is how we coordinate with the MPO on all of that. And that's something we've been working with staff very closely on over the past couple of months. We're also working on, as I mentioned, improving the criteria, working with financial management to make sure we're in line with our fiscal resources and constraints to streamline any updates on that. And then the next step is kind of looking at corridor planning and other sort of just past the STIP year project identification and need identification, how to seamlessly merge that into those outer years. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, this first year, we really focused on prioritizing already identified projects in the STIP and work program. Now we're refining that process and also focusing on identification of long-range needs. So looking at performance metrics across the entire system and identifying where there might be gaps in the performance where we may not have a project already identified, and work to refine that need and develop solutions that will hopefully meet a number of needs with one ultimate project or a handful of projects. As I mentioned, we're continuing to refine the STIP prioritization process as well. And in between those, we're also working on, the sort of third prong is that in between space where it's things like corridor studies, transportation asset management plans, freight plan, all of those kind of statewide plans that identify needs across the system, and merging that from kind of the screening of performance metrics all the way down to identification and prioritization of projects. Next slide, please. The ultimate goal is for statewide needs assessment to better inform and allow the department to be more proactive in addressing needs, allowing for a more balanced program. The system assessment will inventory all Nevada roadways to determine what segments or areas are performing poorly against NDOT 6 goal areas. The project assessment will analyze specific segments or projects against NDOT's goal areas to prioritize projects based on their investment value. So we're sort of taking it from both sides at once, but ultimately, ideally, those system needs get refined in studies and plans, and ultimately identify projects which are then prioritized, as mentioned earlier. Next slide. So part of the screening, I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but we're developing a data-driven process to identify transportation needs across the system within the 6 goal areas, really heavily utilizing data sources that preferably are in GIS format, because then we can sort of map it all out and see where the deficiencies are, but also matching that with other known needs from various plans and studies or input we've received from stakeholders or the public. Needs not addressed, already identified and addressed by projects will be considered for either immediate safety studies, potential corridor studies, or other types of planning concept refinement studies. So if there's not an immediate project that is already known or can easily be identified, we'll work to study that further to identify those. Next slide, please. So the next step, this, as I mentioned numerous times, this is an ongoing process. So our next steps are to finalize the criteria and data to evaluate both the long-term and short-term project priorities, update the data mapping and need identification input requirements. We're working with the data that we have that's easily mapped while we're refining data that is not as easily digestible to be able to use it in the same way. We're conducting pilot statewide needs assessments, improving the coordination and harmonization with the MPO process. As I mentioned, that's something we're really focused on recently. We're realizing, we've kind of refined our process, but we need to make sure the timelines work along with the MPO process, since our projects in the MPO boundaries need to go through the TIP process to ultimately be included in the STIP. So, and then we're developing an annual schedule for the prioritization effort. We have an initial one for this year, and as we work through it, we're realizing some refinements that need to occur, primarily with that coordination with the MPOs. So the annual schedule might include call for needs, help us identify needs we might be missing, developing, checking in on that statewide needs assessment, distribution of priority needs for implementing, for planning, scoping, design, things like that. A pre-STIP project list, so identifying those kind of out years that need to be prioritized to put into that 4-year constrained STIP, and continuing to improve the prioritization and amendment and adoption process. So with that, next slide, I'd be happy to take any questions. Does anyone have any questions? Nothing. Okay. Either I've bored you or stunned you. I'm not quite sure, but if there are no questions or comments, we'll move on to the next item. Mr. Rayborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The next item will be presented by Mr. Andrew Kelman.
Thank you, Craig. Andrew Kelman, Manager of Transportation Planning, for the record. This item is to approve Regional Transportation Plan Amendment Clark 21-03 to the 2017 Regional Transportation Plan, or RTP. Federal regulations require the RTP to be amended when there are major adjustments, or in this case, a new project is added that utilizes federal funding. Next slide, please. This RTP amendment adds one new project. The project is sponsored by the RTC, and it is for the expanded mobility options to ensure equal access to healthy food and community service project. So that's the project name, in the amount of approximately $138,000. This project was selected for discretionary grant funding through the Federal Transit Administration's Helping Obtain Prosperity for Everyone program, or the HOPE grant program. And this grant program seeks to improve transportation in areas of persistent poverty. This project will study potential new microtransit routes that target low-income areas currently underserved by fixed route transit. It will address inequalities in access to healthy food, work sites, and community services. So while fixed route transit may be available in some of these areas, the time spent traveling to these essential services may be burdensome. The study is region-wide and will build off the recently completed Coordinated Transportation Plan and the recently completed Onboard Mobility Plan. Next slide. For the approval process, there is EAC consideration today and RTC board consideration for approval at their December meeting. Since this project is for a planning study, adding it to the RTP does not impact air quality, and it is consistent with the goals and priorities of the existing RTP. Staff recommends approval of this RTP amendment.
Thank you very much. Well, I would say that that's very good news that that grant was received, and it seems like a very beneficial project. So are there any comments or questions from the committee? If there are no questions, we have a motion to approve the amendment.
This is Michael Tassi, City of Henderson. Motion to approve.
Thank you. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. The motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Rayborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So item 28 is to adopt the draft Metropolitan Transportation Planning interlocal contract and then recommend that the chairman sign that interlocal agreement. So as background for this, this is actually something that we started working on with the EAC back in 2018, and in the handoff between the transition from Raymond Hess as director to me as director, this one kind of slipped by the wayside, and so we wanted to go ahead and wrap this up. And so I'm basically just picking up exactly where we left off. I think in March of or February or March of 2018. So in the backup materials, there are three items. One is the unedited, unmarked up draft interlocal. The second item is a track changes version. So what I did was I built on the 2018 version that had been in circulation. And so you guys can see all of the changes that were made to that, and I'll run through the only ones that are really, I think, notable. And then the third item is one that explains why I'm recommending that we do not include the Department of Transportation, NDOT, in the interlocal agreement that establishes the MPO between the local agencies. So with that, I'm just going to jump to that discussion. So basically, as I've talked with other MPO directors in peer communities, this has been something that we talked about. We talked about interlocal agreements in general, and none of the other peer MPOs, and it's really kind of unusual for Metropolitan Planning Organization to include the state DOT in this interlocal agreement that establishes the MPO as essentially the organization representing the local agencies and how that relationship works. There's some governance issues that it raises, but basically all of the things that are requested in the draft that we had been looking at 2 years ago are covered by the planning rules that govern what we have to do as we interact with the state, and what the state has to do as it interacts with the MPO and with the local agencies. And so it's all redundant. And then any of the specific elements that we would want to change on a more frequent basis that reflect things that are really up to date between the local agencies and the MPO and then the state DOT are better covered through the memorandum of understanding that we establish every year, every 2 years really. We update it every year if necessary, but that we update every 2 years with the DOT as part of the adoption of the Unified Planning Work Program. And so that's really the primary reason for that. And if it's okay, Madam Chair, I'd just like to pause and see if there's any comment or feedback on that, because that's frankly, that's the only real notable change between this draft and the draft that we had previously.
Chair, are there any questions or comments on that element of this agreement?
Okay. With that, I'll just move on. The other changes throughout the update are really just updating to make up for a couple of things that have changed over, well, really just one I can think of that changed over the time period between when we were discussing this in 2018 and now. And that's that we've adopted a new public participation plan. And so we updated the references to that. And then dates, but there's been no change in the primary federal legislation that governs this. And so there's no change to that as well. And so with that, I mean, that's really, if there are any questions about any pieces of the draft interlocal, I'd be happy to discuss. That's really what we have to do with this. And then we'd like to recommend that the EAC approve it and then ask the members to take it to their jurisdictions while we run it through the RTC.
Thank you, Mr. Rayborn. Are there any comments or questions from the committee? Doesn't sound like it. If there are no more questions, do we have a motion to adopt the interlocal agreement?
This is Michael Tassi, City of Henderson, motion to approve.
Thank you. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. Okay, the motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Rayborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. Item 29 is to receive a presentation of and to approve the Sustainability Planning Tools and Techniques Inventory Report. And this item will be presented by Ms. Michelle Laramie, one of our senior regional planners.
Great, thank you, Craig. Again, Michelle Laramie, Senior Regional Planner for the record. And as Craig mentioned, we recently completed a research report on regional environmental sustainability planning. So we'd just like to present the results of that report for you today. Next slide, please. So this project is really a response to various discussions that took place over the last year or so around environmental sustainability planning. Or climate action planning, as it's also called here in Southern Nevada. So after participating in some of these discussions in the region, we realized that the region could probably benefit from some additional knowledge in how other large metropolitan regions have been approaching this kind of planning work. So as part of our regional planning UPWP work program, we conducted an inventory of planning processes and best practices for environmental sustainability planning. So to start, you can see we conducted an academic literature review to gain perspective into how the planning literature discusses this subset of planning And then next, we interviewed a handful of peer communities to learn more about how these findings in the literature are actually translating into real work on the ground. So ultimately, we learned that there are two general approaches to sustainability planning, as well as several best practices to keep in mind. And we'll go through those findings in just a minute here. We did present our findings to a technical advisory group made up of local planners from various jurisdictions in the region. And after a couple of meetings, we did some additional research and ultimately their feedback and some of that additional research was incorporated into our final report. And once we had that final report, we did meet with several stakeholders individually to go through those findings and to provide an opportunity for candid feedback and questions before we brought the report forward for approval. So these final discussions were held with all the members of our technical advisory group, and again with some other regional partners who weren't able to participate in the tag itself. And overall, we heard positive commentary about the report and its potential usefulness for the region. And all of our technical advisory group members did feel like their feedback was reflected well in our final report. Next slide, please. So ultimately, we produced a few different final deliverables, which are included in your backup materials. First, you'll see our key findings report, which is a brief high-level overview of our findings. Next, the full report is a more robust report, and it really dives into some of the academic literature we reviewed around the subject. And it also highlights some of the specific planning examples we heard from the peer communities that we interviewed. And ultimately, we believe these materials can be helpful for progressing environmental sustainability planning here in the region. The research provides, again, information on how other large metropolitan regions have come together to tackle environmental sustainability planning. And it also provides insight into the different approaches they've taken towards that work and some of the effectiveness of those approaches. And finally, the best practices for environmental sustainability planning. So once these reports are approved, these deliverables, they will be uploaded to our website at the link displayed here. And our hope is that these reports they'll be available for anyone who wants to do that research and should provide some additional tools for conducting future environmental sustainability work in the region. Next slide. So our findings for this research are presented in two parts. The first is the different approaches that cities and regions are taking towards this type of work, environmental sustainability work. So generally, we found that there are two broad approaches to environmental sustainability planning. The first being a local sum of parts approach, which is really the current approach towards sustainability planning taking place right now in Southern Nevada. And the second approach being a multi-jurisdictional collaborative approach. And I won't go into too much detail here as these are described in your backup materials, and they're pretty self-explanatory, I think. But I would like to point out that our research, it does emphasize the need to adopt multi-jurisdictional collaborative approaches to this type of planning work. But we do find that there are a lot of different ways these collaborative approaches can look. Each community that we interviewed came at this work a little differently, and ultimately their collaboration was informed really by their shared priorities and also the political realities of their respective regions. So in general, regional collaborative planning is still very much a new process for many communities. And we found this is true for environmental sustainability planning as well. And so we found this work, it tends to be, when it's collaboratively done, it tends to be somewhat limited in scope. The communities that we interviewed, they're coming together on areas where they found they had shared goals, such as emergency preparedness and resiliency planning. But some of the more sensitive issues in environmental sustainability, such as reducing carbon emissions or collaborating on land use goals, they were less likely to be prioritized as part of their collaborative work. So we really found that communities were focused on building some early successes in order to build momentum for future work. Next slide. So the second part of our findings then detail the best practice principles we found for environmental sustainability planning. And these best practices were primarily informed through our interviews with peer communities. And most of these communities, they were engaged in some form of multi-jurisdictional collaborative work. So these best practices are presented in three broad categories. Building a foundation focuses on principles for getting started. Supporting collaborative planning processes addresses the work that will be done during the kind of preliminary and initial planning phases. So when you're getting ready to conduct a planning study or a planning initiative, and then adopting a best practice framework, discusses the common elements that other communities have followed when developing and implementing environmental sustainability plans or goals. So within these categories, we found 12 best practice principles. And generally, these 12 principles highlight the need to determine achievable and measurable goals and strategies, as well as the importance for creating performance-based implementation and evaluation processes. The principles also focus on the need for broad and inclusive community engagement, where equity and environmental justice are centered in the environmental sustainability work. And this was something that was really discussed and emphasized with our technical advisory group members as well. Finally, we discussed the need for the work to reflect the community's vision for quality of life and to communicate and educate how sustainability efforts will positively impact our community's future on issues such as public health, economic resiliency, and affordability. Next slide, please. So lastly, as part of the report, we do provide several general recommendations that came directly from the planning literature itself. And these recommendations are somewhat expected. They're common recommendations for improving the landscape of multi-jurisdictional collaborative planning nationwide. And they include adopting nationwide and statewide strategies and aligning local plans with these statewide goals in order to increase funding competitiveness. Recommendations also include increasing collaboration with non-government organizations and the private sector, and developing incentives that increase participation across multiple sectors in meeting state and regional goals. And this last point was also emphasized by our technical advisory group. There was really a lot of discussion around the need to better involve and incentivize our private sector partners and other non-government organizations in this work. And so that full list of recommendations is in the conclusion of the report. And again, it's important to note that these recommendations, as well as the other findings in the report, they are not meant to be prescribed actions for our community. In fact, there are no specific next steps that we include in the report. Instead, the research presented in this report is really meant to be a tool that can guide preliminary planning discussions for environmental sustainability planning work as it progresses here in Southern Nevada. It's really setting a foundation for future work and provide some tools for discussions around environmental sustainability planning and possible collaboration for this work in the future. Next slide. So we're now, of course, in the process of presenting this work to our various committees here at the RTC, and we expect to move forward with this approval process and bring this to the RTC board before the end of the year. So we should have all of that material available on our website very soon. So with that, I'm happy to answer any additional questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Just a note for the good of the group. I think many of you know the state is working on a climate action strategy that should be published electronically on December 1st. Now the constraints of that initial strategy were the timeline set out in the legislative action. So we are well aware, and I say we, NDOT was a part of it. We didn't lead it. It was led by Department of Conservation and Natural Resources and the Governor's Office of Energy, but we partnered in it. But some of the constraints on that was the timeline. And so I think the group that works on it was well aware that that collaborative stakeholder engagement, cooperative process was lacking in that initial strategy development, but that's certainly anticipated to be next steps. So the work you've done here in terms of those regional collaborations, I think will also help inform the state efforts. And I look forward to working with this group, both on your regional efforts as well as the statewide efforts. So this is great, great work and very, very timely. So are there any other questions or comments from the committee?
Madam Chair, this is Craig Rayborn. If I could just make a comment to add to this a little bit. So I just wanted to pass on to the committee members. One of the things that we've heard as we've taken this around to the to some other bodies, the SNS Steering Committee and the Metropolitan Planning Subcommittee, was just an interest in clarification about the role that Michelle, the role this report plays, that Michelle outlined at the end of her presentation. And so to accommodate that, we've prepared a statement that's up front in the report that emphasizes that there are no next steps called for in this report, that it's essentially a study and inventory that is intended to provide information to the region, just like Michelle stated. But we've added that so that it's going to be a bit more clear. That statement, we just finished it this week, and so it's not time for it to have worked into the document that you guys see, but I just wanted to pass that on as well, to clarify.
Thank you for that. And I think the state strategy will identify some next steps, but those next steps are in line with kind of the information presented here. So we'll have to see where this goes, but I think this provides some good information to utilize both at the state and regional level if entities so choose. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Okay, if there are no more comments or questions, do we have a motion to approve the report?
Press release, motion to approve.
Thank you. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say nay. The motion carries. Thank you. Mr. Rayborn.
Chairwoman
Thank you, Madam
Sandra
Chair.
Rosenberg, I just wanted to clarify who made that motion.
Fred Solis, City of Las Vegas.
Thank you, Fred.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Again, Craig Rayborn, Director of the MPO, for the record. Item 30 is to receive an update on the regional work program. And this item will be presented by Ms. Ray Lathrop, Manager of Regional Planning.
Thank you, Craig. Ray Lathrop, Manager of Regional Planning, for the record. This morning, I'm happy to present an update from the regional planning team that's been working on administration of the regional policy plan named Southern Nevada Strong for almost 5 years. It's been a while since we updated this body, and so we're going to give you several examples of some of the work that we've been recently doing. Next slide. Hopefully that you're all already know the basics of the SNS plan. So I'm just going to briefly remind a couple of key points. The Southern Nevada Strong Plan is intended to look over the horizon at actions that can be taken over the next 20 years so that the region can become stronger and more resilient to shocks and crises, not unlike what we're seeing now. The Southern Nevada Strong Plan was written during the long-term recovery from the last economic crisis. And some of the major priorities that were identified as being top issues for the community included jobs, the economy, and schools. Again, something that we're hearing again. The engagement part of the Southern Nevada Strong planning phase was very large, and in fact, the plan won a national APA award for the engagement that was undertaken during the planning process. And so this all means that the regional plan reflected really what Southern Nevadans said they wanted and needed in recovery and then for long-term community resiliency. And then, of course, in 2015, the RTC agreed to administer this plan, which is to promote it and to logically build on it and help build the capacity for others to implement it. Most of the recommendations within the plan are actually define and identify other stakeholders, frequently local governments and other regional agencies for actually implementing the plan. So next slide. The pieces of the SNS plan really fit together for this long-term recovery and the ideas on building on strength and resiliency. These main themes address elements that contribute to a vibrant and sustainable community. And I'm not going to dive into all the different pieces, but I will note that all of these themes really emphasize cross-sector activities and partnership and collaboration with an engaged and informed public. So of course, you know that transportation can support an economy, can support access to vital services. And most of the plan really kind of identifies all of the different ways that these issues and sectors interact. Next slide. The Regional Planning Department has always been working on activities related to the broad communication around raising awareness of the regional plan, as well as tracking the plan's implementation on an ongoing basis. In 2019, our team moved into the Metropolitan Planning Organization, and thus our work activities were included in the current Unified Planning Work Program, where we've, of course, continued with the administration activities related to our role. And then, of course, over the last 5 years, we realized that we could also identify research and technical assistance projects that would provide useful reports and tools, like you just heard, for our local partners to implement the regional plan. So I'll talk both about these two roles in today's presentation. Next slide. So one example of some of the tools that we've been able to build, but then also kind of continue on with what the plan really identified as a priority, has been community engagement. We actually built a community engagement toolkit maybe about 2 years ago based on best practices and examples, and we provided some templates for continued engaging residents beyond implementation and into subsequent planning efforts. Earlier this year, we were updating the community data map onto a new platform and included some additional features. And we were just about to hit upload when the pandemic started and we were all sent to work from home. So we quickly pivoted in order to make sure that this tool was the most relevant in our digital and virtual life. And we've included some additional materials this year that we think can be more helpful for the way that we're working now online. So next slide. You'll see we have a community engagement spectrum, which kind of defines different ways and reasons for doing some engagement. All of these tools now reflect digital resources and best practices to do engagement activities online through virtual surveys or online meetings. The final link here on this that you can see on this picture is the community data map, which takes a lot of our socioeconomic and demographic information and displays it throughout the valley so that people can really find the communities that they're trying to hear from or understand the communities may be impacted by a specific project. Next page. The entire regional planning team, as well as the other planners in the Metropolitan Planning Organization, really did call through a lot of digital and virtual tools over the spring this year, and we wanted to make sure to include a lot of those elements into this toolkit so that anyone can see how the planning profession is attempting to kind of pivot into more digital engagement. So we hope that you can use this toolkit as we venture into probably more time online. Next slide. Our next project related to some of our administration tasks is regional planning update. We aren't driving a plan update, but we are looking at pieces of the plan to review for their progress and see if there are additional resources or strategies that could implement the planning further. The SNS plan also included 4 site-specific implementation strategy reports. And the goals for each of these opportunity sites are very similar, but each one is a little bit unique based on their geography or context. The majority of a process that we outlined to update these strategies is very consistent across the 4 plans, and we hope to have the same deliverables for each one of them, including a progress report, more resources, and additional projects or recommendations for implementation. Over the past 9 months, we've been working with North Las Vegas on updating their opportunity site, and we'll be finishing that report in the next month or so. We're very excited about how that has come together. For the final downtown North Las Vegas site, we've included additional materials and deliverables like a map that puts together all of the vision for the downtown North Las Vegas site into one location, which references several planning documents for that focused area. Some additional placemaking strategies for developing potential district or cultural areas, and new strategies for communication tools to connect with the community around that area. So while we've began finishing up the North Las Vegas report, we've begun a literature review for both the City of Henderson site, which is located at Boulder Highway and Gibson, as well as the Las Vegas site, which is the medical district. Next slide. And the last project that I'll share about tracking some of the progress of the plan and the annual report. This fall, our team has met with all of our steering committee members to gather input as to the overall progress of the plan and determine the region's priorities and activities for the short-term future implementation. We framed this discussion around 2 very important things that are happening now. One is that the regional plan was adopted 5 years ago, and so we want to know what's been accomplished and what's still an active goal. And 2, since most of our partners have been on the front lines of some emergency response from the pandemic, they may have also faced some drastic impacts based on the economic crisis. We wanted to assess their priorities and how we can best assist their work in the next 6 to 12 months. So we're collecting feedback on both what is a priority and what progress has been seen over the last 5 years. And we're excited to kind of compile that hopefully in the new year for where we stand in implementation on Southern Nevada Strong. Next slide. Preliminarily, we've heard a couple of key themes in these discussions, and we'll be building out additional support projects and other technical assistance that we can provide. We've heard our regional partners really shared the priority of affordable housing, and most of the local jurisdictions are working on some solutions to housing challenges, but we're also looking at what can that mean on a regional scale. All of our partners are also kind of contemplating and thinking through environmental sustainability. Of course, we've developed that document that Michelle just shared, so we're just trying to see what that looks like on a regional scale. And then also transit and transportation. Most agree that the goal is to really increase transportation choices as defined in the Southern Nevada Strong Plan, and especially catalyze maybe transit-oriented development in the future. And finally, regional collaboration to ensure that there's alignment across the valley. These are kind of the 4 themes that we're hearing, and we're going to continue to build as we discover new details as far as what all of our agency partners are working on. Next slide. So for the second component of our work program, we were reaching out to a lot of our partners and realized that we have the capacity to analyze some data, maybe map new metrics or indicators, and connect with peer communities to understand how implementation of our regional plan can be done within all of our partners. And we identified 4 research projects that we felt would support and illuminate our region's next steps on implementation of large pieces of the plan. We felt like these topics really had some momentum and interest in taking steps further in our valley. So just a little note, we've already presented the final report for the regional sustainability planning tools and techniques, and we haven't yet started on the tree canopy and social equity research as we're waiting for some new data sets to come available maybe next year. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've been doing on housing in this extreme heat study. Next slide. So future housing study, we're looking at both access and affordability of housing throughout the region. We know that each jurisdiction has housing elements, but we're also curious about our regional capability of accommodating future population growth. Our team has found several plans and studies that look at this question in very different ways. Housing balance with jobs, the cost burden across income levels, and preferences around housing types. The team, we've held a technical advisory group, which is made up of staff of our local agencies, both in the planning departments as well in the social services or community development departments. And we're still gathering a lot of data. But preliminarily, we've been pulling some historic information for some context. Next slide. So this slide shows kind of where we've been. The population growth is the orange line, and then the bar graph below it is the housing permits in the historic, over the last couple of decades. And while housing permits don't necessarily equal new production for the same year, we think that the implications are pretty clear and could be one of the factors that has made housing such a challenge for our community, in that our population has continued to grow and our housing development maybe hasn't kept up on the same pace. Next slide. All right. This is a slide where we're trying to actually maybe forecast out the future housing demand. And so based on our land use partners and planning departments, we have a black line there around the housing that is planning to be developed across the region. Based on some calculations around how our population growth corresponds into jobs and jobs correspond into housing, sometimes we can see either a surplus or a gap in the housing that we're going to build in the future. And so our community is really trying to really project out what kind of housing needs we're going to have. And our team is looking at various ways to make that calculation. So I think if you go into the next slide, you can see depending on how we define these ratios, we may have a surplus and then a gap or an overall surplus in the future. And so our team is working really hard to figure out what kind of calculations are important here and how we can use some of the modeling and forecasting best practices in order to have a conversation about what's needed in the future. We hope to finish up the housing study by the middle of next year and have a full report as far as some implications for our region and our preparedness for the future. Next slide. Yeah, there's an animation here, but there you go. For our second research project, we're looking at the threat of extreme heat events on our region's vulnerable populations and the risks of our increasing warming. Our team has spent a lot of time looking at health and heat research to identify medical conditions that are exacerbated in the heat events, as well as environmental factors that could contribute to increased warming or decreased ability to adapt to extreme heat events. Next slide. Our analysis is built on the fact that there are 3 dimensions of the risk of extreme heat. We know that while everyone can be impacted and is susceptible during an extreme heat event to some extent, these risks are not evenly distributed across our valley nor across the population. Certain communities and neighborhoods would be particularly affected based on the level of exposure, their capacity to adapt, and their sensitivity to that exposure. You can click next. So initially, we defined some of the metrics and indicators that might go into an overall score for these 3 different types of risks. We looked at a lot of academic journals and talked with the public health professionals We looked at some other regions and how they're doing the same type of analysis. If you click next, we do have a technical advisory group helping us think about the ways that this can occurs in our valley. And we ended up including some additional indicators based on their input. So this is our preliminary findings with mapping some of those data points. And of course, there's a lot that goes into making some of these maps because every data point is going to have a different geography, a different unit. And we're very happy to work with very smart planners in the MPO that have been able to help us make some of these tools. So we have here a spatial analysis of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptability, and a composite of extreme heat vulnerability, as seen on the right side of this slide. That composite actually just weighs each one of these factors equally, so it's just the sum of those other three maps. Next, we'll be meeting with each jurisdiction to spend some time looking at their highest risk areas so that we can better understand which individual factors is maybe weighing heavily in those areas. And we hope to find some commonalities across these indicators for the Valley so that we might be able to synthesize some regional recommendations or to better understand how our neighborhoods might differ. We also expect this research to wrap up in the spring of next year and come back for a final approval as far as the final report and recommendations that we see. Next slide. All right. So thank you very much for letting me share with the committee today. We're very optimistic that the Southern Nevada Strong Regional Plan and all those that have contributed to making this vision a reality are helping our region become more resilient during these hard times and a great place for everyone to live. I'm happy to take any questions that you may have on our work and some of these projects.
Thank you, Ray. That was an excellent presentation. Really great work that you and your team are doing. I hope that, I mean, I understand a lot of this work and the studies are resources for the region, and I look forward to seeing how all of the entities use that resource. And I know, you know, I'll be talking with my team too in terms of there's some really robust data sets that you're pulling together that I think can inform a lot of our processes and policies discussions. So I just want to really thank you for the work that you're doing and continue to do. Are there any other questions or comments from the committee?
Hi, this is Johanna Murphy with the City of North Las Vegas. I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank Ray and Michelle for all their work on the Downtown North Las Vegas 5-year progress report. It's a great tool, and it's wonderful to have all of the implementation the city has achieved so far documented in one place. And then we really look forward to implementing the new strategies they helped us develop. So I just wanted to thank them for all their effort on that project.
Wonderful. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, and I would echo that in addition to my prior compliments. Having that documentation also and updates on how everyone's using this is really helpful, because I know a lot of times we do some work and make some progress and then just move on. So having that documented really shows the benefit of the work that Southern Nevada Strong is doing. So thank you very much. If there are no other questions or comments, we'll go ahead and move on to the next item. Mr. Rayborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Item 31 is to receive an update on the City of Las Vegas and Clark County Maryland Parkway Corridor Transit-Oriented Development Plans. This item will be introduced by Mr. Daniel Fazekas, Senior Planner.
Thank you, Craig. And good morning, Madam Chairwoman, and good morning, Committee. Daniel Fazekas, Senior Transportation Planner with the RTC for the record. This morning, I, along with staff from the City of Las Vegas and Clark County, will provide an update to the Maryland Parkway Corridor Transit-Oriented Development Plan. We were going to introduce this project to you back in the spring, but with the pandemic restrictions, we were unable to present. So this morning, we'll provide a smaller intro and overview, and then show the progress we have made, as well as some of the project deliverables. Next slide. So some background, currently the Maryland Parkway Corridor is being developed as a bus rapid transit or BRT route from Russell Road and Maryland Parkway north to downtown Las Vegas and then extending west to the Las Vegas Medical District. And for those who don't know, a definition, transit-oriented development is a type of development typically located close to high-quality, high-capacity transit that creates compact, walkable, mixed communities. Next slide. So a little more background. So in 2018, the RTC and City of Las Vegas applied for and were recipients of a $300,000 grant from the FTA to develop a TOD plan for the Las Vegas portion of the Maryland Parkway Corridor route. The plan's framework is to identify and plan 3 transit station areas, or what we call now focus areas, with the greatest TOD potential. So what you're seeing here is the original map from the FTA application. So starting from Sahara down up north into west into downtown Las Vegas, and then west into the medical district. And a station area or focus area is typically a quarter or a half mile from a transit or station stop. So you're seeing the smaller circles in there is about a quarter mile, and a half mile is the larger circle. And that's typically what you want for a transit, a TOD plan. So soon after the grant was awarded, the RTC and Clark County worked together to develop a similar TOD plan for the Clark County portion of the parkway, so Sahara south to Russell, and we're using UPWP funds for that. There will be 2 separate plans for the corridor, one for Las Vegas and one for Clark County to meet their unique needs. So separate reports and plans, etc. However, we have combined our efforts when it comes to public engagement and stakeholder engagement. And the project team is also combined as well, and we meet twice a month typically. Next slide. So this is the project team. City, Las Vegas, Clark County, and RTC manage the consultant team led by MIG out of Denver. It's important to note here, though, that while RTC is heavily involved in partnering when it comes to community engagement and stakeholder engagement, City, Las Vegas, and Clark County will manage the land use decisions from this plan. RTC will have no say in that. Next slide. The TOD plan aligns well with current or just completed initiatives for each public entity. So Las Vegas and Clark County can talk about their master plans aligning with it. But for the RTC, the plan will provide Southern Nevada a template going forward for planning additional station areas and TODs along other high-capacity transit corridors that were identified through the onboard mobility plan. Next slide. As you see here, the original project timeline was completed was to complete approximately 7 tasks in about a year. And despite the pandemic, we have pretty much stayed on schedule. We anticipate both plans to be completed sometime in this spring 2021. And to talk quickly on the community and stakeholder engagement portion of this plan, again, despite the pandemic, we had to go virtual on all of that. But I do want to note that stakeholder working group with representatives from the private developers, as representatives from private development, community organizations, and neighborhood groups have really stepped up and have been very active and provided great feedback on this process, and we really thank them for that. Next slide. This is currently, one slide back, I apologize. This is currently where we are in the plan development. We are now drilling down on drafting the focus area plans that Las Vegas and Clark County will talk about, and also have begun a robust virtual public engagement survey that I will highlight at the end of the presentation. And now I will hand this over to Marco Vallata from the City of Las Vegas, who will provide more details on the completed tasks. Thank you.
Next slide, please. For the record, Marco Vallata, City of Las Vegas Department of Planning. As Danny mentioned, we're in the midst of gathering community feedback during the pandemic, and even with that going on, the project team has been pleased so far with the results and feedback that we've heard from the community. And I'll quickly run through where things stand. Pre-pandemic, we were able to hold a community open house at the center and we've had some success with some online surveys, both in English and Spanish. We have constituted a technical advisory committee and a stakeholder advisory work group. That's a coalition of stakeholders all along the corridor, from public and private sectors, as well as elected officials, while the technical work groups are working within the respective jurisdictions, the county and the city. We're currently working on gathering feedback on focus areas themselves, and specifically for 7 areas using a map-based tool called Maptionaire. And as of this week, we've received about 400 responses. We have MIG working on the focus area plans, as Danny mentioned, of which those community surveys will contribute additional information and data. We've also received a number of deliverables I'll run through here in a couple slides that provide the city and county some context and a general lay of the corridor. Those are all available on the project website that's listed here, rtcsnv.com/Maryland Parkway. Next slide. So we have done a review of the existing conditions up and down the corridor, taking a look at the individual focus areas themselves and how we got to those specifically. We took a look based on the needs assessment, profiled each of the focus areas themselves that allowed the consultant team to rank and compare each one together at each different station along the corridor that was selected. The profile also provides some geographic, socioeconomic, demographic data that allows us to look specifically at what the makeup is in those 1.5 mile areas immediately around each of the areas. Next slide. Market readiness measures development potential based on a number of econometric variables, and we were able to use each one to score the focus areas themselves, depending on what those variables are. When you add together market momentum and development opportunity based on factors such as rent and development, some development potential, we were able to quantify that and provide a total score. Next slide, please. The workforce housing plan helps study housing characteristics throughout the corridor. We know that within the central part of the city, we have a little bit more diversity with respect to housing, but we also know that we need to even go beyond that with respect to multifamily housing and single family housing types. And so this study really helped focus in on what some of the needs are, particularly with respect to density and diversity of different housing types. There were recommendations for both the county and the city, as well as some case studies with respect to developing specific types of affordable housing, as well as some implementation tools that could be taken by each respective jurisdiction to help get that housing built within each of the areas themselves. Next slide. Value capture is the set of strategies that the city and the county can use to capitalize on the transit investment that's being made. It's also there to provide recommendations that both jurisdictions can take to leverage the potential change in value on the land use within each of those areas. So recommendations may include things that have that are available to both the city and county now that they could do, or they might reflect some legislative changes that might need to be taken in order to effectuate whatever those recommendations are, in order to help monetize and implement specific recommendations. Next slide, please. So there are 7 focus areas, and we'll go on to the next slide. We were able to take the data from those those reports themselves and the community feedback that we've received to date, and really take a look at how we could energize, catalyze, amenitize, and strategize on different focus area types, because each one has different characteristics, and some of them may be a little bit more ahead, so to speak, in terms of their development potential to create transit-oriented development versus other ones where we might take a little bit more work to really plan out how a particular corridor or station area itself might need to be shaped to be more transit-oriented. Next slide, please. And you can see here with respect to the readiness spectrum that categorization. And again, this is done quantitatively. You can see that within the city, the Bonneville Transit Center has some pretty high TOD readiness, has the ability to really be taken to the next level within the area around it. And things that the city is doing in particular can help advance it quite a bit in terms of getting that development immediately around that transit station itself to the next level. Within the county, for example, you see, based on the readiness score, the area around UNLV has high potential as well, based on some of the things that are immediately around there. But again, unlike downtown, it is a different area. It has more of a focus on the university students, the faculty, staff, and the residents that live immediately around that part of Maryland Parkway. Next slide, please. So within the city of Las Vegas, we're able to align with some of the existing efforts that have been going on over the past 5 years. And we looked particularly at the medical district, BTC as mentioned, Charleston and Maryland Parkway, as well as jointly working with the county on the Sahara intersection, given that we have a common shared boundary, although there's a little bit of a difference there. Our master plan for downtown Las Vegas doesn't include the stretch between Charleston and the Sahara, so it made a lot of sense to look at that 1 mile stretch there in particular. Next slide. So in the downtown master plan, we've identified these mixed use hubs, which is another way of saying transit-oriented development within the geographic footprint of downtown Las Vegas. And really what we're doing with this plan is carrying out the implementation. We want to continue on some of the efforts that have been going on with respect to economic diversification, business attraction and retention. And our downtown master plan, which was adopted in 2016, really focused in on how to do this. And this particular Maryland Parkway TOD plan is helping us get to that next level and plan out those areas, especially the medical district and Fremont East, which we've already done a lot, but some of those other areas that are along this route that make a lot of sense. Next slide, please. So one of the implementation items of the downtown master plan is to update development standards. And so far we've been able to do that with the adoption of Title 1909, our form-based code. And it's important to point out here that that's where a lot of the transit-oriented development design elements end up getting incorporated, really bringing the street and the properties and the buildings that are around them together and focusing in on the human scale, making sure that architectural features make a truly functional walking environment. And so far we've worked on those two areas, but with this Maryland Parkway TOD plan effort, we'll be able to get some of the other areas through the studies and help hopefully make some additional rezonings and other design changes as a part of the overall implementation. Next slide, please. And we also have an overlap with the city's 2050 master plan, which was heard last week at our planning commission meeting and at the city council in the upcoming meetings. The basis for the 2050 master plan is infill redevelopment and transit-oriented development along strategic corridors that align specifically with Southern Nevada Strong, as was mentioned in the previous item, and the onboard high-capacity transit plans that have been talked about at previous meetings. As it relates to the Maryland corridor itself, we have direct alignment with new land use place types that are within the plan that would accommodate the TOD typology itself. So as you can see, our trajectory has been to align what we learned from the focus area surveys and with some of these other complementary efforts, as well as the information that's been gathered and shared from the existing condition report, the market readiness study, and the workforce housing plan. So with that, I will pass it along back over to Danny, and we'll continue on with the county side.
Thank you, Marco. And now I'd like to introduce Greg Servin from the Clark County.
Hi, Greg Servin, Senior Planner of Clark County Comprehensive Planning for the record. So based on the criteria mentioned earlier in the presentation that Marco was talking about, the county selected 4 focus areas within its portion of the corridor. And based on the existing conditions and market readiness and meetings with the stakeholders and elected officials, these 4 areas basically kind of rose for the top for us. The first one being Sahara Avenue, which we do, as Marco mentioned, we share with the city of Las Vegas. We also have Desert End Road, came to the top with the cross traffic from the other bus routes on Desert End. Also covers portions of Sunrise Hospital and Boulevard Mall. We also did Flamingo Road, which also has a bus route going along Flamingo Road that intersects with the Maryland Parkway corridor, and also is kind of the northern extent of UNLV, which, as Marco also mentioned, that UNLV came pretty, the area around UNLV came up pretty high as far as market readiness and TOD supportiveness. And then we also have University Road, which is one of the gateways into the UNLV campus. It's also where the RTC Transit Center is located at, so there's some synergies associated with that. Next slide. So the Maryland Parkway Corridor TOD plan will lead to and supplement the Transform Clark County project that is currently underway. Transform Clark County consists of updating the county's master plan out until 2050 and also includes a rewrite of the Title 30 Development Code. 6 core values have been established as part of the master plan update, being core value number 1, unique communities, neighborhoods, and lifestyles, which focuses on housing access and affordability, historic preservation, and looking at established and complete neighborhoods. There's also core value number 2, equitable access to services and amenities, which focuses on parks, trails, and open space, health and human services, and arts and culture. Core value number 3, a healthy and sustainable natural environment, which looks at things such as air quality, energy, water, natural areas, and federal lands issues, which probably does not apply so much to Maryland Parkway, considering it's mostly developed. Core value number 4 is a more connected Clark County. And that both relates to not only just transportation, but also with the this kind of regional collaboration, and also with being a transparent and inclusive government to with their citizens. And core value number 5, a diverse and resilient economy, looking at employment and education, workforce, and business, being a business-friendly environment. And core value 6 is predictable growth and development, which looks at growth management, development quality, adequate public facilities, and things along those lines. So the Maryland Parkway Corridor TOD plan will be keeping these values in mind as it's being written, so in order for this plan to also be able to synergize with the master plan update that's currently being done right now. Next slide. And with that, I'll kick it over back to Danny to talk about our public outreach right now.
Thank you, Greg. For the record, Daniel Fazekas with the RTC again. Finally, this morning, we want to highlight that there are focus area surveys that were launched last month to help us better understand what the community values and what improvements are needed. We're asking users to take short surveys on one or all 7 different focus areas along the corridor. Next slide. The series of online surveys are in English and in Spanish, and they independently address each identified location along the corridor. Users are being encouraged to do one or all of the individual surveys that address neighborhoods where they live, work, or visit. We're hoping to get significant feedback from residents, workers, and visitors in the neighborhoods and who work within the focus areas on what kind of development they think is appropriate or what would benefit them in their quality of life. The surveys are visually interactive and take approximately 10 minutes to complete. And we do if a user does put their email in, they are automatically put into so we're incentivizing the survey essentially. And if you put your email in, you get put into a drawing for a gift card. I believe we have 4 gift cards that we'll be doing at the end of the survey. The survey is virtual and digital. We recognize that. So it is available in hard copy or paper form as well. And we're working with our stakeholders to get that out to the community and community members who are requesting that hard copy form. Next slide. Again, we anticipate the plan or both plans to be complete this spring, and that's when we will present a final report to the EAC around that time. Are there any questions?
Thank you all for that very thorough update. Are there any questions or comments from the committee? Okay, thank you again. We will move on to the next item. Mr. Rayborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The last item on the agenda is the final citizens participation.
Thank you. This is the second time set aside for public comment. Just a reminder that comments will be limited to the first 500 words, with the remaining words to be included in the written record. Do we have any comments?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. David Loria again for the record. There are no public comments at this time.
Okay, thank you very much. Boy, this has been one of our longer EAC meetings, but I've enjoyed getting updates on all the great work that everyone is doing and continuing to coordinate on all this great work and help each other out during this difficult time. So are there any remaining final comments from the committee? Okay, if there are no additional comments, I will close the item. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.